Blood satellite.
I don't like that word, woke. I don't like wokeness. I've mentioned this on the show before. I mentioned it in the chat. I don't accept that framing. On one hand, there's people on our side who say, go woke, go broke. I've heard that 100 times. And it's not necessarily true. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. There's other forces at play. But when it comes to media, like, oh, woke things lose money. Sometimes they don't. Really, it doesn't matter, because we don't really get honest box office shit anyway. We're in a different sort of entertainment paradigm where selling tickets doesn't fucking matter anymore. But also, like, what is wokeness? And it was interesting because we had not an argument, but a discussion, I suppose, a heated discussion in the chat about wokeness. And within 5 minutes, I got 5 different definitions of what wokeness was. No one really knows. I have my opinion on what it is, but it's a thing everyone talks about. Like, this is the woke regime. America's a woke nation projecting wokeness across the world. And one person will say, well, wokeness is just kind of like liberalism. Or a lot of our people on our side think wokeness just means gay shit. My view was like the word woke actually came out of like the black empowerment movement. Like woke was literally like a black woman, like stay woke, black fist raised in the air.
Yeah, it's easy to forget, but I recall that. It wasn't that maybe only 10 years ago. It was it was like an Ebonic phrase.
Yeah. So if you want to get technical, it was that. To me, if you want to get autistic about it, and we do, wokeness is broad modern leftism through a black filter. If people remember the Black Lives Matter movement and how it started, there was a lot of Marxist stuff thrown in there. It was a lot of black empowerment, but some vague anti-capitalism, but it was a black person's understanding of anti-capitalism. So it was kind of dumb and didn't make sense. A lot of people forget early Black Lives Matter, that there was so much Marxist and leftist rhetoric in there. And when I say leftism, people say, what do you mean by leftism? I'm like, I mean the very distinct Western cluster of sort of pseudo-Marxist, pseudo-anarchist, race politics, all that bullshit in there. Like when I say leftist, everyone kind of knows what I mean by that. But it's through a distinct black lens. And so I'm like, okay, that's one way to look at wokeness. But really what wokeness is, like if I had to describe it now, it would just be social entropy. Like what does it represent? And someone in the chat made a good point. It's like, let's not describe what it is. Let's describe what it accomplishes. Fair enough. Well, what it accomplishes is chaos. It's complete disintegration of the social fabric of social institutions. Like, so if I had to define it, it would just be social entropy. That's why it doesn't make it's gay shit. It's feminism. It's promotion of open drug use. It's gay pride parades being blasted at children. It's like the destruction of everything. It's a mess. It's chaos. It's entropy. And what's interesting is that entropy can almost become the status quo. And that's kind of what I'm afraid of happening. And like, I'm trying to wrap my head around this idea. And we're going to get into this in the next episode when we speak about Hans Morgenthau's Power Among Nations. And I touched on this earlier about how the thing you got to realize about the current global system right now is it's very historically unique. That all throughout history, there was, of course, empires and, of course, hegemons and wars and everything, but there's a lot more unexplored areas on the map. But in the modern world, power is kind of fixed, and we're just trying to like chain. It's transactional right now. The fact that there's so much awareness of each other, the fact that there's so many power structures in the world that are invested in maintaining the status quo, that means that it's like the current state of entropy can almost be made stronger. And I think that's what a lot of people are struggling with, because they see things breaking down, always in the process of breaking down, but never fully breaking down. Like if the car is on fire, it should come to pass that the car eventually stops and explodes, but it just seems always on fire, right? Because there seems to be a system in place that's not fully letting the system break down. It's almost maintaining it in this constant state of breaking down. And I think that's a historically distinct thing that never before have we had the global power superstructure to allow things to perpetually be breaking down. That seems to be what's happening in the West, and that seems to be what wokeness is. And there was this article I had read. It was kind of interesting. I've heard this term thrown around a lot called Turbo America. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah, I was asking about that the other day, and I think it was Paul Fahrenheit or somebody had brought that up. I'm like, what the fuck is Turbo America?
Yeah, it's kind of what it sounds like. It's the idea that, despite America's flaws, despite all the things that's going wrong, America is as strong as it's ever been. So I'll just read a couple parts from this article. It's called Turbo America. It's Fisted by Foucault, which is, I've talked about some of their stuff before. I don't really agree with everything, but I agree with this insofar as it's a topic that's being passed around, and some people might not know what it is. So I'll just read a couple things to clarify and explain what parts I think are relevant. So he says here, I get a lot of shit when I bluntly state that the USA has never been more powerful than it is today. People will point to the USA's deindustrialization, its opiate death crisis, its falling living standards, its disappearing middle class, crumbling infrastructure, the growing divide between red and blue states, and the collective meltdown of half of America thanks to Trump's surprise win in 2016. All these points are valid, but they also mean fuck all in the greater power scheme of things. He says, to effect change, a segment of the elites needs to defect to the side of those seeking change. The USA today is a picture of elites united in total. Now, I'm not sure I agree with that. And this is kind of the problem. Like, I'm not sure. In fact, I don't think there's ever been a period in history where the elites have all been aligned on one thing.
With all these people, there seems to be a habit of hyperbole to make a point or to get clicks. I think if you just want to talk generally, that there's a pattern that over the past 50 years, the GOP and the Democrats have become more in line with each other than they were, and that many institutions have become more interconnected and less adversarial than they were. I agree. I think that's fair. Now, to say that America today is a picture of elites as a unified power, no, that's fucking ridiculous. But I think there's a pattern. I think there's probably a pattern.
See, to me, when we say the elites are in agreement on everything, I would say they don't need to be.
No.
They actually only need to be in agreement on one thing, and that is maintaining the status quo. And maintaining the status quo requires a multitude of different plans and strategies. That requires a lot of rebalancing of things. So really what I'm trying to get at is when people say, like, the system wants things this way. Like, what does that actually mean? Like, what do you mean the system? What do you mean? I think a way to describe it is the concept of the status quo, which is not discussed a lot, but it's very popular in geopolitical circles. This constant state of enclosed and perpetual entropy, this kind of disintegration, but never fully disintegrating, has become a status quo, and that international relations of the power elites are just that permanent ratchet keeping there, because they would rather maintain that than relinquish control to change they don't really understand. And that is what the boomers are. And that's why, to circle back to the boomer argument, like, boomers are, I think, the last vestiges of that. And it's hard for me to predict this. And I really want to just drill into people's heads, like, everything we're talking about right now might change drastically once the boomers die. One thing I'd seen recently was, everyone hates George Soros, right? And even back in the day when the right was like at its peak hating of George Soros, a few of us had the idea. I'm like, well, George Soros isn't like the Darth Vader of the world. Like, there's lots of George Soroses. And then his son is apparently worse than him. And how do we know this? Because George Soros' son went public and said, I'm worse than my father.
George Soros' son has given his first interview since taking over his father's $25 billion empire. The younger Alex Soros claims, quote, I'm more political than my father, adding, as much as I would love to get money out of politics, as long as the other side is doing it, we're going to have to do it too.
Right? Which means that George Soros, as much as we hate him as a destabilization agent, was a more reliable destabilization agent than whatever's coming down the pike, right? Which is to say that the last vestiges of that status quo might die with the boomers, and I actually don't know what that looks like. And maybe there's this idea that, I always come back to, like I said, the worst thing you can say to someone on the dissident right is, what if this never ends? We spend all our time talking about what we'll do when society falls, when the West has really fallen. It's like, what if the West never falls? See, because what's interesting is, once you really dive into geopolitical history and international politics, it becomes clear how recent all of these rules are. Because a lot of our political theory is based on the Western model, and it's only a few centuries old. And it seems that every couple centuries, something upsets the balance and changes everything forever. The story of international politics is paradigm shift after paradigm shift. Like World War I changed everything. It introduced a new model for European power. It's never gone back to how it was, and how it was for centuries and centuries. So it's like, there is no norm in international politics. It seems that something insane happens that changes everything until the next insane thing, right? And maybe that's why people are so married to the status quo. But I keep looking at it and I'm like, there is no, it's very easy to get locked in this sort of Spenglerian idea of every civilization has a cycle, every empire has a cycle. I'm like, in the past, but there's a lot of unique historical pressures on us right now that, with all the technology we have, with the international awareness, with the wealth and the fucking the race towards this sort of transhumanist future, like, I don't think there's any way to use a model of the past on what's going to happen in the future. And I want to introduce the idea that, like, we always think the West has fallen. I'm like, no, the West is falling. The West will keep falling forever. You're going to feel like you're falling forever. And that's worse than hitting the fucking ground. But what do you do in a situation where you're constantly fucking falling? Because at least when you hit the bottom, you have the the sanity to know where the bottom is. You're never going to know where the bottom is. You're just going to have this paralyzed feeling that the ground, like, you'll feel more paralyzed than if you hit the ground, is what I'm saying. There's this part here where it says, Turbo America means that the USA openly engages in coercion of both opponents and allies to get its way. There's little to stop them, so why not do it? Hiding behind the mask of democracy and global norms, the USA introduces new concepts of rule globally to further cement its rule and gain advantage for its corporations. And here's an interesting stat that I didn't know, and this is really what I wanted to get to. US introduced sanctions have increased by a staggering 933% in the past 20 years. Since 2000, the number of underlying sanction authorities have grown from 69 to 176 in 2021. Basically, he's saying that just the amount of sanctions in trade and economics that America has put on other countries has gone up by 900%, which is the new way it tries to exert control over both its enemies and its allies. So if Turbo America isn't so much about military strength, it is that in a sense, because the military can protect trade routes and whatnot, but it's more of an economic force. And so the idea of Turbo America, as he says it, is it doesn't really give a shit about its subjects. And this is something we were talking about last time in the Clash of Civilizations, which is, if we want to use that model that there isn't really America, there's just the West. There's the West with America as its core power and Europe as its vassal states, and maybe one day South America incorporated. But if that happens, then that's going to signal the end of white sovereignty and dominance in the West. It'll just be this kind of, amalgamation of people. He says, by combining its economic strength with its military, its soft power, and its technological advantages to dominate and micromanage its Americanizing client states while engaging in a proxy war with the nuclear armed Russians and moving towards cutting China down to the size in East Asia and the Pacific, the USA is on the path towards full spectrum dominance. The only question remains to be seen is whether they will succeed. In the meantime, Turbo America will continue to steamroll and Americanize everything in its path. And this is kind of where I was coming back to with wokeness being constant but controlled entropy. And, you know, when people talk about like the greater American empire, what it's exporting, people say it's exporting wokeness, it's exporting LGBT, it's exporting. I'm like, yeah, but like, okay, let's say it is wokeness, but let's recontextualize wokeness as social decay as society. Does that make any sense? Like, that is kind of what we have here. The sort of like, it's chaos, but within the structure of the state, it's constantly happening, and you can export that to completely destabilize other countries. Okay, I'm just going to read another part here from the article on Turbo America. So this is relevant to what we were just talking about. It says, France has fallen to Americanization, where Catholicism has been eroding for a very long time, but where a French civilization remains separate from that Anglosphere. And he's quoting someone else here named Fourquet. All the French people are going to jump down my throat. Fourquet. I'm just going to say it. Fourquet. 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 How about that?
Fourquet.
It's Fourquet. Oh, whoa. How would an Italian say, whoa, buddy? Oh, whoa, buddy. Okay. Americanization, Fourquet writes, has profoundly transformed France. Although 27% of French people have visited the U.S. At least once, every second person among the wealthy has done so. The upper classes are fluent in English. Macron voters are the most proficient in this language, while Le Pen voters were the least, and consume mostly American media. Both the elites and the working classes began to dream American dreams. Fourquet calls one of them the Plaza Majority lifestyle, after the name of the celebrity real estate agent Stéphane Plaza. In his TV shows, he advertises an ideal shared across French society, a house with a garden, a desire that mimics the American suburban lifestyle. Depending on the class, this ideal assumes different forms, but it often includes a swimming pool. Americanization was the only component of globalization that did not bitterly divide the French. According to Fourquet, the split between those of whom globalization meant achievement and for those for whom it meant dispossession would, from 2017, become central to understanding France. As in the United States and Britain, globalization swept the French economy. So I think that's a very interesting thing about, like, this is what I was getting at right before you cut off. And, you know, I'm getting in the weeds on this, but it's like part of it's economic, I suppose, like, you know, having, you know, a good lifestyle, sure. But in another sense, the weaponization of Western culture, like if we do agree that wokeness is being exported, and we also agree that the definition of wokeness is just this constantly falling, this constantly disintegrating social fabric that never fully disintegrates, that merely justifies itself by the fact that it's still existing. You know, it's always, if it's always kept on life support, that almost justifies its existence, and that makes it, to the outsider, a sustainable status quo. Then if you export that, it's like, it's a weaponization that doesn't seem like a weaponization. It's social decay that doesn't seem like social decay because it's purported to be stronger than what it's replacing, even though it is just entropy itself.
You deconstruct it so far, and it almost, like, the word almost has no meaning anymore because it can mean so many other things.
I'm trying to. This is what I keep trying to wrap my head. Like, because when you talk to people, it's like everyone we're debating about what woke this means. Like, what is it? Just, it can't just be gay stuff. It's the other stuff too. But I don't know. We'll get into this right now, actually. So this is all leading up to a book that I read recently that was written in the 60s, but it deals with this. It's called American Diplomacy by George F. Kennan.
He was an alarmist about the Soviet Union who became an apologist for the Soviet Union. He was an enthusiast for covert operations. Indeed, he deserves probably the title of having, more than anyone else, invented covert operations for the Central Intelligence Agency. And yet, he came utterly to despise covert operations. He was a man whose marriage lasted 74 years, who was also a philanderer. He was a prophet who wound up being profoundly depressed by his own vindication. This is really strange stuff. And while arguably the most famous grand strategist of his age, he's a man who would much have preferred to have been known as himself a biographer of Anton Chekhov.
This is the 60th anniversary edition. And this is a very popular book for if you're into geopolitics, if you're into international relations and diplomacy generally. This is sort of one of those foundational texts that, it might not be totally relevant right now because a lot of what he talks about is relationship with the Soviet Union and China. A lot of the data he's pulling from is old data, but I think it helps you understand how diplomats think and how, especially American diplomats think, and how international relations actually. And this is contributing to the behavior of the people who are actually doing what we are talking about, the exporting of wokeness. And this isn't a conspiracy, really. Like, there's a lot of people who are a bit more hawkish on the shit-lib front who will basically, you know what? We are exporting gay marriage to Ukraine. What of it? We are trying to export Western values. And what are Western values? It is Black Lives Matter. It is transgenderism. Like, it's not uncommon to hear that. It is exporting feminism, democracy, quote unquote freedom, all that stuff. So it's not like we're telling fucking tales out of school here. It's just we talk about it in a different sort of language, but we are exporting that in service of what? Okay, let's say it's for Western self-interest.
And I would have thought that Mr. Kennan would have been pretty uncomfortable with the Truman Doctrine.
He was, absolutely.
Because it was the universality of it. And
the Truman Doctrine, of course, is famous for the undertaking to come to the assistance of people who are suffering oppression throughout the world. It's an extraordinary thing to promise in March of 1947 when the United States had nothing like the capability to do this. And most historians say that this was hyperbole. Indeed, it was Atchisonian hyperbole because the idea was Atchison's, to exaggerate the danger in order to get a specific bill through the Congress, aid to Greece and Turkey. Kennan was sympathetic to that, but he hated the universal justification for it, and said so at the time.
He goes back into American history and talks about the rise of American diplomacy. And this is what I was talking about before, that if you look at the history of power relations and geopolitics, a lot of this stuff is relatively new. And he mentions in the book, America right now is obviously, it's turbo America. But America was kind of late to the game in participating on the world stage. And Europe was really running things up until, obviously, the end of World War I and World War II. And what's interesting is, remember, way back when we were talking about the Mitrokhin archives. And the Mitrokhin archives were a bunch of leaked documents from the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And one thing that became clear was that the Soviet Union was first through the gate on the Cold War. America really was late in getting involved, to the point where there were so many Soviet spies in America. There was so much communist infiltration. It's actually insane. And there was next to no Western infiltration of the Soviet Union. There was no real Western subversion going on in there, because the Soviet Union was the first to act on it, and America just kind of didn't get it. And that was the argument Kennan was making in this book, which is that America was very, very naive when it came to international relations and diplomacy. But it kind of got there though, and it took a very interesting route to get there. But what he starts off by talking about the Spanish-American War. And these are lectures, so these aren't it's not an essay, it's not an academic paper. He's speaking very casually. But he's describing the Spanish-American Civil War as essentially a war that was forced through the American press, because for a long time America was very isolationist. America famously, even in World War I, didn't want to get involved, and a lot of Americans still yearn for a day when America isolationism was something of a reality. I don't think it could ever be a reality again, nor is he saying that, because one of the cases he's making in the book is that if America tried to be isolationist less, it could have actually prevented certain things. It could have had more control over what happened in Europe, and that its determination to kind of be late to the game kind of fucked up, a lot of these conflicts for the worse for Europe and for the West generally. But he's saying the Spanish-American Civil War was essentially a war that was forced by the American press and the arms manufacturers. So America gave Spain a crazy ultimatum that almost forced Spain into a conflict with America.
Spanish-American War brought about the end of Spanish colonial relevance in the Americas and a new chapter for the United States. While the conflict itself was between Spain and the United States, it actually stemmed from dissension in Cuba, as the Cubans fought to gain their independence from the Spaniards. Despite the fact that the United States refrained from becoming involved in the first Cuban movement for independence, known as the 10-Year War, which began in 1868, the young nation took a much different approach the second time around, when Cuban rebels came together once again in 1895 to demand freedom from Spain's colonial rule. The United States became exceedingly interested, as well as sympathetic.
And this is what happened. This is kind of the story of Cuba. And it says 11 days after the declaration of war in Cuba, America actually pursues Spain to the Philippines and takes them from Spain by force, despite no mention of the Philippines previously than this. So he's saying that it's interesting that America gets involved in this war for its own self-interest and then just kind of acts on its own to take the Philippines for no fucking reason. It just have them, and it still has the Philippines, kind of. And the Philippines, if you go ask Filipinos, like, they're kind of like a cross between Spanish and American. And he says with Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, and Hawaii, in 1898, America for the first time unilaterally acted to take colonies with no intention of granting them statehood. And there's a lot of arguments for and against this at the time. And this was America's first foray into this sort of thing. So the debate over this was long and voluminous. Much of it was concerned with legalities, but these were not the real issue. The real issue was one of expediency and wisdom. The proponents of expansion advanced a variety of arguments. Some said that it was our manifest destiny to acquire these territories. Others said that for one reason or another, we had a paramount interest in them. Still others maintained that we, as an enlightened and Christian nation, had a duty to regenerate their ignorant and misguided inhabitants. Another argument was that they were necessary to the defense of our continental territory. Finally, it was alleged by the commercially minded that we had to take them, Hawaii and the Philippines in particular, to assure ourselves of a fitting part in what was regarded as the great future trade with the Orient. The opponents of expansionism argued partly in legal terms, challenging the constitutionality of such an arrangement, but their most powerful arguments were those which asked by what right we Americans, who had brought our country into the existence on the thesis that governments deserve their just powers from the consent of the governed, could assume the rights of empire over other peoples and accept them into our system, regardless of their own feelings as subjects rather than as citizens. And the main thing he says in the book that I found interesting was that American diplomacy is unique in the sense that it always tries to cloak itself in a moral or ideological pretense, but it never really means it. He gives one example of the open door policy that in Chinese territory, because China was being kind of torn in half by Russia and Japan and all these other places. And America comes in. America had this thing where it always come in and try and be the moral arbiter and say that, no, we should have an open door policy. No one should own China. There should be no power struggle. We should all be here. And really, even though America rather was taking a moralistic approach, what that did was kind of just assure trade for them in Britain. So it was always going out and saying something was a moral mission, but it was really in America's own self-interests. And this is something that are really introduced to the world scene, because not a lot of people were doing that up until that point. Everyone was, and this is something that we'll get into in the next episode too with Hans Morgenthau, with the rise of nationalism generally means that prior to the rise of nationalism in like the 19th and 20th centuries, you had like power debates and wars and struggles that were a bit more cynical but open. Like people were saying, yeah, we just want power, we just want territory. But with nation states, you had this sort of moral approach where we are right and this is moral. And if you're against this, you're against good. You're against goodness. And that changed the conversation in the international stage. But he makes a point in there that once you do that, you introduce the idea of total war. And that's kind of without it, as long as power debates are cynical, they can be transactional. But if you're on the side of good and the other is on the side of bad, that introduces this idea that, oh, we're going to fight to the last man now. That was a crazy idea. You can never get people on board with that. But, you know, as long as America is really forcing the conversation on morality, kind of like it's doing right now, you can fight to the last man on any issue. He's got a thing here. He says, we have noted that when we summoned other powers to declare their adherence to these principles, there were good reasons why they would agree to do this, but there were also reasons why their replies would almost invariably be guarded and qualified ones, hemmed in with their significant reservations. So America would always come out and say, we demand that the international powers sign on to this set of principles, these accords that guarantee certain freedoms, but those certain freedoms would also benefit America in some way. He says, they have not been confined to the Far Eastern affairs. The tendency to achieve our foreign policy objectives by inducing other governments to sign up to professions of high moral and legal principle appears to have a great and enduring vitality in our diplomatic practice. It is linked certainly with the strong American belief in the power of public opinion to overrule governments. It is also linked, no doubt, with the pronounced American tendency to transplant legal concepts from the domestic to the international field. So it's like, even back then, it was this sort of idea to like transplant American values on the international stage, smuggled in through morality. And this was introduced in such a way where other nations kind of felt like they had to like sign on to it because it's good, you know. Here's what I think. So far as I can judge from the evidence as I have seen, it was assumed by American statesmen that whatever was uttered or urged in the name of moral or legal principle bore with it no specific responsibility on the part of him who urged it, even though the principle might be of questionable applicability to the situation at hand. We were at liberty to extort, to plead, to hamper, to embarrass. If others failed to heed us, we would cause them to appear in ungraceful postures before the eyes of the world opinion. If, on the other hand, they gave heed to our urgings, they would do so at their own risk. We would not feel bound to help them with the resulting problems. They were on their own. It was in this spirit that we hacked away year after year, decade after decade, at the positions of the other powers on the mainland of Asia, and above all the Japanese, in the unshakable belief that if our principles were commendable, their consequences could not be other than happy and acceptable. One example he gave that was so interesting that I never really considered before, but it makes so much sense, about how America entered World War One despite concerns about neutrality, right? So, like, imagine how contradictory that is. Like, to be isolationist, to want to be neutral, but then once you enter a war, you kind of ideologically pivot on the reasons once you're involved. He says this is a central part of American diplomacy. Like World War II is a great example. Like America didn't really get involved in the European theater, not really until Pearl Harbor, right? People talk about this all the time, but that has transformed in time to that America. This World War II was America's war. It was a war fought against evil by good. But if you look at the history up until that point, like the American will hold two thoughts in their head at the same time. One, that America fought a war against evil on the side of good, and two, that they only really entered the war when they were provoked. You actually can't have both of those at the same time. Yeah. It doesn't make sense. But he said an interesting part of American diplomacy is that you will hold both of those thoughts in your head at the same time, because really what we're getting at here is that ideological and moral justifications do not fucking matter. But in American diplomacy is a master at just the fact that it could pull that off for such a long time, even to this day, is a masterstroke of diplomacy, to believe that everything you're doing is good and you're on the side of good. And this is what we were just talking about with sort of the exporting of the woke stuff. It actually doesn't matter what the fuck it is we're exporting. It doesn't matter what we are using. It's always going to be good, because it has to be. Because the only way you can get people to sign on to anything is to think it's righteous, to the point where you can convince them that their own degradation and sorrow is on the side of the angels.
Given his thoughts about America and wishing that it were perhaps back in the 1920s or 30s, whatever, if he had been advising the Soviet Union or China or whatever other country, what would he have said about internal contradictions within the United States, and perhaps they should use containment?
Well, he did say this, not to those countries, but certainly throughout his life, he was very much aware of the internal contradictions within his own society. And after the United States really became one of the two great superpowers, and particularly after it began to build up its, in his view, excessive military strength, he often said that the job of Americans, the more important job than containing the Soviet Union, was containing ourselves. Because it really is the case that for much of the last half of his life, he viewed the United States as much of a danger to international peace as the Soviet Union.
One thing we'll get to next episode with the Hans Morgenthau book is like, what is imperialism? Imperialism is changing the status quo, full stop. Imperialism is not just economic exploitation. There's economic exploitation that goes on all over the place. Just because, a big bad country is using another as a vassal state, that's not necessarily imperialism. What imperialism is like changing the operating system of whatever that nation or people or civilization is. So in that sense, if we want to talk about in this frame of wokeness and the exporting of wokeness, it is an exporting changing of the status quo wherever it is. And I think that's why once you look into that terms, it seems more extreme. Like, it's not just teaching people about freedom, it's completely changing the mind and body and soul of the nations through this sort of entropy that we're exporting. But it's done with this same system of American diplomacy outlined here, which is that as long as you cloak that in a moral good, it doesn't even matter what it is, because there's a long history of America just taking shit and then figuring it out later. And the example we gave is look at World War I, look at World War II. And scholars of these wars will understand this, and people in our scene will understand this, but you understand them, most people don't, right? He says, Once in the war, we had no difficulty in discovering, and lost no time in doing so, that the issues involved in it were of the greatest significance to us. It is surely a curious characteristic of democracy, this amazing ability to shift gears overnight in one's ideological attitudes, depending on whether one considered oneself at war or at peace. Day before yesterday, let us say, the issues at stake between ourselves and another power were not worth the life of a single American boy. Together, nothing else counts at all. Our cause is holy. The cost is of no consideration. Violence must know no limitation short of unconditional surrender. And think of how many times that pivot has existed in our lives, seeing different conflicts and seeing, how many times when it's not worth one American life, now it's worth even in Ukraine, there might have been a time where it said we want to avoid war. It's not worth one Ukrainian soul. Now it's worth every single one of them. We actually don't give a shit.
Yeah.
Look, I always bring it back to the Ukraine war right now between Ukraine and Russia, because I think it lays bare the cynicism at play here. Everyone on the right kind of sees that Ukraine is being used as this sort of puppet state, but really and I'm not the first to comment on this, but really look at how, they don't give a shit how many Ukrainians are thrown into that meat grinder, but they are also. But this is in the service of good. This is the service of individual liberty. Really, how many people are you going to send carelessly into the slaughter over that? And now that all makes sense. He says, let me try then to sum up the main conclusions to which I am carried by the observation I have put before you here, and by the earlier ones brought forward by the Chicago lectures. We have seen a variety of the faults of American diplomacy as they have revealed themselves over the entire span of the 20th century. Up to the Second World War, they were largely the fault of a young and somewhat naive people, overtaken by the heady and disorienting forces of modern nationalism, coupled with the unsettling consciousness of our own growing strength, which was rapidly elevating us into the ranks of the major powers. We were affected in those years by something of the relatively innocent erraticism of the adolescent who is becoming aware of his own strength. Since this last great war, a wholly different situation has come into being. We've been put as a nation to entirely different tests, obliged to deal with a wholly different order of demands. Now, sometimes we have responded, I think, as well as any country could or would have responded. But in other instances, and I hope these lectures have shown, we have not. He said, when you stop to think about it, it's not surprising. We are a nation which has no traditional concepts of military strategy or of the place of military power in the structure of our national life, except for our own civil war, which is quite a different thing and was fought for a different purpose. Our involvement with the use of armed force in the modern age have occurred primarily in the confusing and to some extent misleading experiences of two world wars of the century. Both these wars ended in unconditional surrender, encouraging us in the view that the purpose of war was not to bring about a mutually advantageous compromise, but to completely destroy the power and the will of the adversary. In both those wars, but particularly the second, we departed increasingly from the principle embodied in the earlier rules of warfare, that war should be waged only against the armed forces of an enemy, not against the helpless civilian population. There's one other thing here that he mentions earlier that I think also adds a bit of context to this. He says, let me expand a bit on this tendency of ours to insist on seeing as blind puppets of some other great power weaker or smaller factions. There seems to be a curious American tendency to search at all times for a single external center of evil to which all other troubles can be attributed, rather than to recognize that there might be multiple sources of resistance to our purposes and undertakings, and that these sources might be relatively independent of each other. We can talk all day about the bipolarity of power that was introduced by the Cold War and Russia versus the Soviet Union, which again was a historically unique situation that had never existed before. But so you're combining all these sort of unique American outlooks, and that's what he's talking about here, the unique American outlook. And remember, this is a public policy and international relations landmark book. The belief that we're always cloaking our perhaps cynical, but also materialistic, but also imperialistic goals in ideology that can pivot at any given time, that there is a tendency to, based on America's experience with war as a civilization, to see total war and total capitulation as the norm. And that all wars have to be fucking total dominance. And also that it's usually America or the West versus some other central evil power. Now, I don't know if that last one is true now. I do think there is an understanding of multipolarity in the American state apparatus, but I do think those first two remain, or at the very least, they're still employed. This sort of what he calls the legalistic, moralistic approach. We still employ the legalistic, moralistic approach to all international affairs, whereas historically, that's not what was used at all. But when you use the legalistic, moralistic approach, everything is a lot more black and white, and it seems that much larger conflict is inevitable. Now, what do you think about all that? Again, this was written in the 60s, but I still think a lot of it is relevant today.
Yeah, no, it's reasonable.
Yeah. And a lot of these like 20th century geopolitics books kind of make the same argument that everything was better when we had kings and princes. But I liked this book because it showed the relationship of us, by us, I mean the West broadly, of utilizing this sort of moral goodness and almost force teaching that to the rest of the world. I think America is still the leader of that, and I still think that a place like China and these other great powers, they might say they're doing that, and that's why when I look at like the Eurasian multipolarity thing, they're kind of giving lip service to the American way of doing things. I don't think they actually believe it, though. What's interesting is I think Americans in the West actually believe it, and I think once you have, and this is what I kind of wanted to end on, that with wokeness or this social entropy that's being utilized in imperialism, like I do think there are true believers. I don't think it's entirely, just a facade that these people are doing. Like I honestly think that there's a lot of Westerners who truly believe this is the side of good and this is worth fighting to the last man about. And I think that you can call it naivete or call it idealism, but I think that naive idealism is lacking in a lot of these other countries, and I don't think they can really win unless they have that naive idealism. Maybe China does, but I don't know. China and Russia both seem really beaten down still. Like they talk like we're the Middle Empire and they might believe it, but like I don't know. Like they're almost they're depressed. They don't seem as like insanely virile. And that's where like that Turbo America stuff comes from. It's like it shouldn't be this aggressive. This insane social degradation shouldn't be this excited, but it is, right?
Yeah.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.